show, guys. On this edition of the Correspondents, North Korea launches an ICBM missile and stokes fear across the globe. How is Washington reacting to the latest threat? A collision course on global issues as G20 leaders gather in Hamburg. The United States, Germany, and a host of nations holding a historic summit there to tackle climate change, trade, and much, much more. But that summit is likely to be overshadowed by the first face-to-face meeting between Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. What we can expect on this edition of The Correspondents. Hello, I'm Millar Sega, and this is The Correspondents on Voice of America. First up, North Korea's launch of what it claims was an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, triggered serious concerns around the world this week. The test suggests that Pyongyang has now achieved a crucial milestone in its pursuit to perfect its nuclear weapons capability. China and Russia have already weighed in. But the real question now, what will Washington do? VOA's Arash Arabasadi has our report from Washington.
North Korea claims its latest test was an ICBM. The missile fell in the Sea of Japan, and the true capabilities of the weapon remain unclear. The missile test, the 11th this year, has stoked fears the isolated nation may be closing in on a weapon capable of reaching the United States. Late Monday, President Donald Trump tweeted that North Korea has just launched another missile, asking, "Does this guy have anything better to do with his life?" referring to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Speaking at the White House alongside South Korea's president, Trump declared the U.S. has run out of patience with North Korea.
The era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. Many years, and it's failed. And frankly, that patience is over.
So joining us now to talk about the latest North Korean provocation, we are joined in Washington by VOA White House correspondent Pete Heinlein, along with national security correspondent Jeff Selden. I thank you gentlemen for joining us. There's a lot to talk about, this big giant threat. So Pete, first question to you. So the president says the tactic of patience appears to have failed. Has he given any indication whatsoever of what he plans to do?
Well, he said we're looking at severe measures, but he won't say what those are.
Yeah, we don't know what those severe measures are.
No, he's playing it cool. He's not playing his, he's keeping his cards close to his vest. On the other hand, there's this other track, Secretary of Defense Mattis saying, no red lines, this doesn't bring us closer to war. So we're seeing pressure that the administration is putting on China and other friends to try to, or allies, I should say, and interested parties, not necessarily friends, to try to put pressure on the North Korean regime. But the North Koreans have always been a bit impervious to that kind of pressure. So it's going to be a real chess game we're playing here.
So Jeff Selden, on an issue such as this, does the president need to be clear? Does he? Do we know what the range of options that are available to the United States are right now?
Well, all the options are on the table. The military officials, intelligence officials, under this administration, previous administrations, despite previous administrations going with the strategy of strategic patience. All options have always been on the table, and that includes military options. It is interesting, though, that after President Trump came out and talked with the Polish leader about how he was considering severe things and how something is going to have to be done about this very, very bad behavior, that then his Secretary of Defense comes out, meets with the press in an impromptu session at the Pentagon and starts walking it back, saying this doesn't bring us closer to war, as Pete talked about, but also noting that it is a grave concern that every test that the North Koreans conduct gives them more information, noting that this ICBM that was launched had a re-entry vehicle at top, which would have enabled the North Koreans to potentially arm it with a nuclear warhead. Now, was that re-entry vehicle viable? Could it have worked? Would it present a threat? Has it shown that they've taken another step? Those questions still need to be answered, but there's a great deal of concern, and there's a lot of diplomacy going on. There's going to be a lot of wringing of hands and pulling of arms behind the scenes, trying to get the world to take some sort of coherent action to force North Korea to back off a little bit. But the thing is, the one thing that the North Koreans care about more than anything else is regime survival. So unless that is threatened in any way, it's a big question what these other measures can do, because to threaten the regime, do you need to bring in the military? And if you bring in the military, you could see a cascading effect where you destabilize the entire region.
Pete, does this raise the threat level, the fact that they now have an ICBM capable of perhaps attacking an American target?
Well, I think the key word there is perhaps. We don't really know if they're threatening the mainland, if they could reach Alaska. We have to assume that they're getting close. And that's a game changer. At least that's what Kim Jong-un wants us to think. And it does put more pressure on the U.S. administration. Sure. And the U.S. administration is responding in some way with more financial sanctions, especially financial sanctions on China, trying to get China to play a more active role. But as I think it was Charles Krauthammer, the columnist for the Washington Post, pointed out this morning, it's really not in China's interest to cooperate. They don't really share an interest in putting that tremendous pressure on North Korea. They like to have North Korea as a buffer. They wouldn't want to see a unified Korea.
So Jeff, to Pete's point, it's not in China's best interest, actually, to destabilize North Korea. That would cause problems for China itself, right? So is it right for the United States to have actually been counting on China for their help? Can we count on them in the future?
Well, China wants two things. If you talk to former intelligence officials, other former government officials who have looked at this issue, one, they want a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. That's in their interests. Number two, they want stability. But what these former officials say, the problem is that China wants stability more than they want denuclearization. So that becomes an issue. Also, China has been doing more, if you listen to administration officials talking about this, to ramp up the pressure on North Korea. The problem they run into, according to some officials, is that North Korea, despite a lot of people looking at it as this hermit kingdom, this backward place where all they're doing is putting money into a weapons program where everything else suffers, they've been very ingenious. They've been very creative in the ways that they go about funding their activities and the way that they go about tweaking the West and other nations, perhaps, that they have a grudge against. So it's a very difficult thing. So what you hear a lot about now is not the primary sanctions, but the secondary sanctions. And so you're really drilling down into some of the banking system, some of the banks, some of the cash operations, which you wouldn't ordinarily target. Can it be done? Yes. Is it as easy to do? No. And how long is it going to be before it actually has an impact on the regime? Those are questions that are a little bit more difficult to answer.
Pete, but do sanctions work against North Korea? I mean, we seem to have tried this before. We tried the P6 talks, and that didn't seem to help much.
No, the history of sanctions is not so good. On the other hand, let's see if some of these banking sanctions that Jeff was talking about will eventually really put the screws to North Korea, because they depend on that money to fuel their nuclear program and their ICBM program. That's the money they're depending on to keep us at on our back feet.
Right, but Jeff, when you tighten up the screws, as Pete suggests, aren't you also tightening up the screws against China? I mean, isn't China the one that seems to be upset more about this? The fact that Chinese banks are now being sanctioned by the United States.
Yes, although again, China's exhibited a willingness to do a little bit more and has ramped up some of the pressure. It's a matter of how far is China willing to go, because again, their main interest is stability, and they don't want to destabilize North Korea. They don't want a situation where all of a sudden you have some sort of war, active war breaking out. Technically, it's still in a state of war between North and South Korea, but they don't want an active war where all of a sudden refugees are flooding their borders and they have to deal with that type of crisis. We're talking a lot about the region, but there's bigger concerns here as well, because it's not just a threat to the region. One of the things former officials worry about with North Korea, as one put it a few months ago, they'll sell anything to anybody. So any technology they develop, any capabilities they develop, they're liable, in order to make money, raise money to prolong the regime, sell it to somebody else, sell it to actors, perhaps terrorist organizations. You know, are they doing that actively with some of the missile technology? Perhaps, but it's always a concern. So it's not, it goes beyond China. So what is Russia, which says it worries about terrorism a lot? How are they going to react to that? How firm are they going to get? There was some suggestion, despite some hesitance by countries like China and Russia to do more, from the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, the other day, that perhaps these nations, it's more public posturing. Sure. Perhaps they're not as firm when it comes down to it as they would appear to be.
10 seconds. I'm running out of time. Is this issue likely to come up today at the G20?
Trump and Xi are actually talking today, and you bet North Korea will be top of the agenda.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Pete and Jeff. It is time now for a quick break. When we come back, leaders of the world's 20 largest economies gather in Hamburg, Germany, as tensions ratchet over trade, NATO, and climate change. We'll talk about who wants what and what they're likely to get. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better.
In his native Somalia, Abdikadir Adam watched neighbors injured by bomb blasts bleed to death en route to the hospital. So, with his life savings, he bought and built his own ambulance.
First ambulance I paid, I remember the only money I was having, 4,200 I paid. And well, my family was telling me to stop this job.
10 years later, with help from donors, that single van has grown into a fleet called Amin Ambulances, Somalia's only free ambulance service. Beyond the violence, Somalia also faces severe drought, and the lack of basic services puts many at risk.
We are not dealing only the explosions, but also we deal with pregnant women. We took the children who's in diarrhea.
Adam says his dream is to reach all of Somalia with emergency transportation, adding helicopter support to his fleet to get people to help even faster. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
VOA, telling America's story for more than 70 years.
This is the voice speaking from America and the war.
VOA exports America's most powerful product, freedom of speech.
Close the waters.
In parts of the world, information is scarce and oppression real. VOA, sharing a voice that says, we report the truth.
I am Sheikha Salih, host and senior editor of VOA's international call-in talk show, Straight Talk Africa.
Today we'll examine the tobacco industry.
We pretty much touch on anything that you can think of. Politics, health issues, human rights issues, you name it, we talk about it. The issues that we discuss are pertinent to most people on the African continent. A very, very rare and unique opportunity to interact with their leaders.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. While U.S. President Donald Trump and German Chancellor Angela Merkel appear headed for a collision course on a number of issues, from climate change to trade, as they meet for the Group of 20 summit of leading economies in Hamburg, Germany. But as VOA Europe correspondent Luis Ramirez reports, other economic and security issues could have the potential to bring everyone together.
President Trump says he has bold plans to slap tariffs or impose quotas on steel imports, the latest and perhaps most serious of threats to protect U.S. industry and part of his America First strategy, one that has G20 partners feeling nervous.
And what he's doing, he's throwing all kinds of cards up in the air, NAFTA, a critique of climate change, because he actually wants, I think, a bit of zero-based policy. I think at the end of the day, he probably, of course, wants free trade in the win-win sense. But what he's trying to expose is perhaps some of the hypocrisy of countries like China, who talk the talk of openness, but don't always deliver. So there's going to be a real clash of the titans at this summit.
Trump's shock talk has brought results. After threatening to not stand by NATO allies who do not pay their share of defense, came pledges by members to boost their contributions. He said he would rip up the North American Free Trade Agreement, and now he has a deal with Mexico on sugar exports. The U.S. leader's target now is China and its cheap steel exports that are blamed for killing jobs not only in the United States, but in Britain and other G20 states, including Germany. Climate is a big issue for some G20 leaders, but analysts say the threat of cheap Chinese steel imports could be a common cause and take precedence.
And joining us now for the latest from the G20 summit in Hamburg, we welcome VOA senior correspondent Luis Ramirez on Skype from Hamburg, Germany. Hey, thanks for that report, Luis.
Good to be with you.
Before we get started on the various issues that were outlined in your report, Luis, I want to talk to you about what's been going on there in Hamburg. There's been a lot of clashes between police and protesters. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's been a really violent 2 days, Mel. We've had, first of all, just before the summit started, massive protests. Thousands, up to 8,000 demonstrators, all leftists, all anti-G20, taking to the streets, trying to launch a march that they call Welcome to Hell. Police were able to disperse that using water cannon. That happened on Thursday, but on Friday morning, as the summit was getting underway, they decided to change their tactics a bit. Rather than try to all gather in one place as they had done before, they dispersed throughout Hamburg, trying to block access by delegations to the G20 venue. Caused a great deal of problems. Again, police turning up with water cannon, tear gas to break them up. And in some cases, they succeeded. Their aim is to disrupt the summit. They haven't been able to do that. They haven't been able to get near the venue. But as far as impeding delegations from getting to where they need to go, that certainly has happened.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to pay attention to what's going on outside of the G20 summit. But that summit, Luis, is Trump's second visit now to Europe. You covered that meeting in Brussels last May when he told NATO allies to pay up or shut up. Are European leaders still upset about that?
Well, I'm more upset. I think they're nervous. And the one thing they have come to expect from Mr. Trump is surprises. He certainly surprised a number of people by one of the things he said in Brussels. Here, and especially in his earlier stop in Poland, made it clear that the United States stands behind its Article 5 commitments, that is, its obligations to defend any NATO ally against attacks from the outside. That was a very welcome statement for many European leaders who were nervous about that. Now they're hoping to see what he really means when he says he's putting America first and that he wants to return jobs to the U.S. The big, what's making people so nervous here is this appearance or this perception that the United States is becoming more isolationist and adopting more protectionist measures. Now, that said, none of the G20 members have adopted protectionist measures of their own in response to that perception, which is a positive sign and one that can be interpreted as meaning that they are waiting to see just what he will say at this 2-day summit.
For now, some reassurance there at least. But Luis, what do you think are the most contentious issues as this summit gets underway?
Well, number one, Mel, it is trade, most definitely. As I mentioned in my report, this matter of a glut of cheap Chinese steel exports that's really causing disruptions in economies from Germany to the United States. That is something that all sides have in common, something that the U.S. administration is very angry about and very determined to do something about. And so that is a very, very big issue here that could bring everyone together. Now, the things that are driving them apart very clearly also trade, because the U.S. is or at least is threatened very bold action on members of the EU, other G20 members on the matter of steel exports, and also the issue of climate change. Some people here, Angela Merkel for sure, very upset about his decision to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord.
So, Luis, are you anticipating any kinds of resolutions or agreements on some of the issues that you just mentioned?
No agreements, really, but certainly a great deal of progress in terms of FaceTime, in terms of establishing rapports that are so necessary, personal rapports that are so necessary between world leaders to be able to reach a consensus. Now, again, no one is ruling out any surprise from Donald Trump, and that could be in the form of concessions in regard to trade. It could be maybe not acting on these threats that he has made. That is the great hope that people are coming into the summit with. That said, he has delivered on a number of other threats and certainly, stuck to his guns. And one example would be in his meeting today with the president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto. That meeting was supposed to happen shortly after Trump's inauguration. It didn't because they disagreed on the matter of the border wall that Mr. Trump wants Mexico to pay for. Well, going into that meeting, Mr. Trump dug in his heels. He said he continues to expect Mexico to pay for that border wall.
All of these very big issues, Luis, but likely I'm wondering whether or not the much anticipated Trump-Putin meeting is going to overshadow a lot of these issues. I understand there's already been a handshake between the two leaders.
Well, you're absolutely right that it's going to overshadow. It is the story of the day. These two leaders, so much said about them, between them, that all eyes are on that meeting. And the two men did run into each other at the start of lunch, gave each other a friendly handshake. There were going into the meeting. Vladimir Putin was heard saying, "I am delighted to meet you," to Mr. Trump. So that seems to be getting off to a good start. We don't know exactly what they'll talk about, although we do have some good ideas of what they'll be discussing. We expect
we'll be hearing more from you on that issue. Thank you very much, Luis. It's time now for another break, but when we come back, Daniel Sheriff and Peter Heinlein will join us on the set to talk exactly about that very much highly anticipated, high-stakes first meeting between Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. But first, a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
This is BizBeat.
Food waste, such as bad fruit, can be costly to a business, and that's where Cecilia Larson comes in. According to Larson, 30% of the fruit market goes to waste.
It could be reason that the box are broken or have been damaged in transportation. It could be tiny dots from hail. It could be damp boxes.
Larson's Swedish startup Rescued Juice takes rejected fruit from supermarkets like apples to make apple juice. She gets boxes where 3% of the apples are bad, but the other 97% are good.
So this is a pallet that we got today with apples, and as you can see, this apple is quite perfect. So what we do is that we sort the good ones from the bad and make juice from the good ones.
The pallets of apples come from as far away as Argentina and South Africa. Larson produces more than 40,000 bottles of juice a month and delivers the product to 150 stores and eateries around Sweden. For VOA's BizBeat, I'm Philip Alexio.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Now, for the main event, the much anticipated first meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Both leaders have expressed a desire to repair relations between the two countries, but expectations for that are pretty low, partly because those relations have been clouded for months by ongoing investigations over suspected Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. VOA's Moscow correspondent Daniel Sheriff has our report.
The White House says President Trump will decide what to discuss, calling it a normal bilateral meeting. But Trump could raise any topic, say analysts.
The president has his own impulses. He may decide he wants to push the meeting in some unexpected direction, and we have to be prepared for this. This is a little bit his style.
However, ongoing investigations into the Trump campaign's alleged collusion with Russia are casting a shadow over administration hopes the meeting could lead to improved relations.
Everything that happens between Trump and Putin is going to be seen in that context. Was Trump too friendly? Was Trump actually trying to seem very tough on Russia in order to quiet down his critics back at home? I think those are a lot of questions that we'll see the answers to very shortly.
But few expect Trump to raise the issue of Russian hacking that U.S. intelligence say was aimed at helping him get elected. On the streets of Moscow, Russians still hope after the two leaders meet, relations will get better.
It can't last long. Someone should realize that if we do not collaborate together, we do not progress.
But is there room for collaboration? Joining us now to talk about what's at stake, we're joined here in Washington by VOA senior Moscow correspondent Daniel Scherf, who filed that report. Welcome to Washington, by the way, Daniel.
Thank you, Mark.
And once again, by VOA White House correspondent Pete Heinlein. Thanks for sticking around. It's good to have both of you. Pete, this meeting is kind of a big deal, isn't it?
It is.
Why so much interest?
Well, these are possibly the two most powerful leaders in the world, after all. But I think we probably should put this into perspective.
Sure.
This is a get-to-know-you session.
Okay.
This is a session where there's really not going to be much of an agenda. They'll probably sit and have coffee, and they might discuss their families. Of course, they'll have an agenda. They'll talk about the serious issues. The Russians want to get back to compounds that they have here, and that's a big issue for them. They're going to be talking about that. They want to have the economic sanctions lifted that the United States and others have put on them over Ukraine. They want to talk about Syria. They want to see if they can get some cooperation with the United States on Syria. And the United States, Trump will, of course, be talking a little bit about election interference, although he probably doesn't want to talk about it too much.
I guess that is a $64,000 question. We can discuss that a little bit later. But Daniel, I'm interested in your take because you've lived and you've worked in Moscow. You're going back shortly. Is there as much interest on this first meeting between Putin and Trump in Moscow as there is here in the United States?
I think there is quite a bit of interest. I mean, we saw incredibly high expectations among the Russian public and, of course, among the Kremlin that relations between Russia and the U.S. would take a 180 after Trump was elected. Sure. Because of his praise for Putin during his campaign.
They were celebrating in Moscow, weren't they, when Donald Trump won?
To some degree, there was. There was some celebration, but there was also just a lot of hope and expectation that this could really change things. Trump wants to cooperate with Russia and Syria. He made that statement during his campaign. So we'll see if that's something that these two leaders may be able to take forward. The U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had said that there could be discussions on some kind of cooperation on no-fly zones in Syria, on the peacekeepers on the ground in Syria, coordinated delivery of humanitarian aid. These are all possibles. But whether or not they'll actually get to the substance of that in this half-hour meeting in Hamburg, we'll have to see.
Right, because they only have a very limited time here, Pete. I mean, I'm told that there's like an hour to discuss, and you've got interpreters in the room there, so that's going to cut that time short. But the big question, and you raised this earlier, is the president going to raise the issue of Russian meddling in the 2016 election?
Well, of course, that's a big question. I think he is, just so he can say, I did it. Otherwise, he'll be criticized from here to eternity for avoiding what his critics think is a critical issue in the bilateral sphere.
And Daniel, you may have a closer take on this, but Vladimir Putin is not an easy adversary. He's quite a tough adversary from what we understand. What is this meeting likely to, how is this meeting likely to go?
Well, certainly Putin is very experienced in dealing with world leaders. He's a former KGB agent, so he knows how to deal with people. He knows how to manage and, you could say, manipulate people to some degree. President Trump, as we all know, came into politics as a complete amateur. He doesn't have experience in politics. He's getting a lot now, a bit of a crash course. But he does have, we have to say, a great deal of experience when it comes to negotiating. He's been in the business world a long time. He's met with very wealthy, powerful people before in terms of negotiations. So he does bring that to the table.
I can't believe we're out of time. I was going to ask you, I mean, are we underestimating the president here real quick?
I think the president is a slick negotiator.
Okay,
himself.
we shall see. My thanks to Daniel Scherf and Pete Heinlein, and of course all our correspondents today. That is all the time we have for the show, but we hope you'll join us again next week for another edition of the Correspondents. Until then, you're never too far from the latest news from around the world. Just bookmark our website at voanews.com. You can also check out all of our programs there. Click on the Watch tab and you'll get it. And don't forget, we're also on Facebook and YouTube. I'm Milar Sega. Thanks for watching. For now, so long from Washington.